Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history of Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The town of Blackwood Junction, nestled in the eastern hills of Kentucky, appears on few maps today. Its absence is not accidental. By 1903, the settlement that once housed nearly 300 souls had dwindled to fewer than 50. The county records mention a population decline due to economic factors, but local archives tell a different story. What happened in the winter of 1903 transformed Blackwood Junction from a hopeful mining community to a place people deliberately forgot. According to the Lexington Herald's archives, the winter of 1903 was unusually harsh in eastern Kentucky. Temperatures dropped below freezing in October and remained there until April. The ground froze solid, rivers iced over. And in Blackwood Junction, something awakened in the old Harland mine that should have remained buried. The mine itself had a troubled history even before the events of 1903. Opened in 1876 by industrialist Edgar Blackwood, it was initially celebrated as an economic boon for the region. The coal seam was rich, and the operation expanded rapidly. By 1880, over 100 men worked the shafts daily, delving ever deeper into the mountainside. The town grew around the mine, houses for workers, a company store, a small church, and eventually a schoolhouse. Blackwood Junction seemed destined for prosperity, but the deeper they dug, the more problems emerged. According to county records, the first unusual incident occurred in 1883 when 3 miners reported hearing conversations in a newly opened shaft, voices discussing everyday matters, though no one else was present. The mine foreman dismissed their claims, attributing them to coal damp affecting their minds. The miners were reassigned to different sections. 2 weeks later, one of them disappeared during his shift. His lantern was found at the entrance to the shaft, where he'd reported hearing voices. The man himself was never found. This pattern repeated over the years, reports of voices, followed by disappearances. By 1899, the incidents had become common enough that miners refused to work certain sections of the mine. Production declined. Edgar Blackwood, determined to maintain profitability, brought in new workers from outside the region, men who hadn't heard the stories, who wouldn't be influenced by local superstitions. In the summer of 1902, a partial collapse sealed off the deepest section of the mine. Rather than clear it, Blackwood ordered his engineers to open a new tunnel in a different direction. The decision was ostensibly financial. Clearing the collapse would be expensive, but some accounts suggest Blackwood was influenced by the mine foreman, who insisted that section should remain sealed. According to a letter Blackwood wrote to a business associate in Louisville, the foreman had become unreasonably disturbed about conditions in the deepest shaft, claiming the air there was wrong and the silence too complete. 2 months after the new tunnel began operation, a more catastrophic collapse killed 12 miners and led to the mine's closure. The official investigation cited improper shoring techniques and possible water damage to support structures. Unofficially, survivors reported hearing a conversation from nowhere just before the collapse, as if invisible people were standing among them, discussing whether the supports would hold. The mine was deemed unsafe and operations suspended temporarily. Blackwood remained in the town, living in his mansion on the hill overlooking the settlement, reportedly working on plans to reopen the mine once conditions improved. Those plans never materialized. The first disappearance occurred on November 12, 1903, and everything changed. Samuel Garfield, the town physician, was last seen entering the woods near Ravens Creek after responding to an emergency call from a homestead. The call reportedly came from the Blackwood estate, though later investigations revealed no one at the estate admitted to sending for the doctor. The peculiarity of his disappearance wasn't just that he vanished without trace, but that his medical bag was found nearly a mile away. its contents meticulously arranged in a perfect circle on the forest floor. Nothing was missing, nothing was damaged, just rearranged. The town initially organized search parties. They combed the woods for 3 days before a blizzard forced them back. When they returned, the medical bag had vanished. The circle of items remained, now partially covered by snow, preserved exactly as they had been found. According to Sheriff Thomas Harding's report, it appeared as if someone was watching us, waiting for us to leave before retrieving the bag, but leaving the items untouched. What makes this case particularly unsettling is that Dr. Garfield was not just respected, but feared in Blackwood Junction. Standing at 6'4" with shoulders like an ox, he was known to have broken up brawls single-handedly. Whatever or whoever removed him from Blackwood did so without signs of struggle. The investigation into Garfield's disappearance was handled quietly, too quietly, according to some. The local newspaper mentioned it once, then never again. Town meetings ceased discussing it after the second week. It was as if the town collectively decided to forget. But they couldn't forget the sounds. The Blackwood County Register, a weekly newspaper that served the region until 1948, contains a peculiar editorial published on November 20th, 1903. The piece, ostensibly about winter preparedness, includes this unusual passage. Citizens are reminded that clear communication is essential during these cold months. Speak plainly and directly. Avoid unnecessary conversation, particularly after dark or in isolated areas. Remember that words once spoken cannot be reclaimed. The editorial was written by William Hayes, the newspaper's owner and editor since 1891. Hayes was known for his straightforward reporting style, making this metaphorical and cautionary language out of character. More telling is that Hayes stopped publishing the paper entirely in mid-December 1903, leaving town without explanation. When the Register resumed publication in February 1904 under new ownership, no mention was made of Hayes or his whereabouts. December brought with it an acoustic phenomenon that defied explanation. Residents reported hearing voices emanating from the abandoned mine shafts. Not screams or calls for help, but conversations, normal, everyday conversations, as if people were discussing the weather or daily chores, but at odd hours and from impossible distances. Mrs. Eleanor Whitaker, the postmistress, documented in her personal journal that she heard her own voice discussing a letter she had handled earlier that day, though she was alone in her home at the time. Whitaker's journal, discovered in 1949 during the renovation of the old post office building in the neighboring town of Millfield, where she relocated after leaving Blackwood Junction, provides one of the most comprehensive first-hand accounts of the early manifestations. Her entry from December A, 1903 reads, "Heard myself again tonight. I was reading by the fire when my own voice came clearly from the kitchen, reciting the address on the Hargrove letter exactly as I had read it aloud to myself while sorting mail this morning. When I gathered my courage to investigate, the kitchen was empty, but the voice continued, now from the parlor I had just left. It spoke in fragments now, words and phrases I had used throughout the day, assembled into new sentences that almost made sense but didn't quite. Most disturbing was hearing myself say, 'Eleanor knows but won't admit it. I have not spoken those words, ever.'" Subsequent entries document the progression of these experiences. By mid-December, Whitaker reported hearing not just her own voice, but those of others in town, conversations she had witnessed, recreated with perfect fidelity hours or days later. She began keeping a log of when and where she heard these acoustic anomalies, noting patterns. They occurred most frequently near dusk, were clearer during snowfall, and often seemed to emanate from the direction of the mine, regardless of where in town she was. The phenomenon spread. More residents reported hearing their own voices or conversations they'd had privately, sometimes days later, echoing from the mines or forest. Sheriff Harding attempted to investigate by setting up listening posts around town. His deputies reported hearing the sheriff's own voice giving them instructions they'd never received. Deputy Michael Collins provided a particularly detailed statement preserved in the county archives. Collins was stationed at the old mill at the edge of town on December 18th, tasked with documenting any unusual sounds. At approximately 9:17 p.m., he heard Sheriff Harding's voice from inside the abandoned structure issuing orders for a search pattern. Collins, believing the sheriff had arrived to join him, entered the mill. He found it empty but reported that the voice continued, now seeming to come from just behind him, always just out of sight. The voice recited what Collins recognized as instructions Harding had given during a town meeting 3 days earlier, but with key details altered, names changed, locations reversed. Collins reported feeling a presence moving around me in the darkness, studying me, though I saw nothing. The audio recordings that exist from this period, primitive phonograph cylinders the sheriff ordered from Louisville, contain only static and occasional rhythmic tapping that experts at the University of Kentucky in 1963 determined was consistent with the pattern of a human heart. The original recordings were reportedly destroyed in a courthouse fire in 1967, though transcripts of the analysis remain in the university archives. Professor Alan Thornton, who led the analysis, noted several anomalies in his report. The rhythmic patterns exhibited variations that initially appeared random, but when graphed over time, displayed a clear mathematical progression, as if something was experimenting with the patterns, methodically testing variations. More disturbing was Thornton's observation that the final cylinder in the sequence contained a pattern identical to the human heartbeat, but impossibly precise, as if created by a machine attempting to replicate the organic irregularities of a human heart. Thornton's conclusion was that the recordings were elaborate hoaxes, though he couldn't explain how such sophisticated acoustic patterns could have been created with the technology available in 1903. By January 1903, Blackwood Junction had changed. Residents began avoiding each other. Conversations in public spaces ceased almost entirely. Church attendance dropped to zero. According to store receipts preserved in the County Historical Society, purchases of locks, bolts, and weapons increased by 300%. Most tellingly, no one ventured out after sunset. Store ledgers from this period show another unusual pattern, a sharp increase in the purchase of materials that might dampen sound, heavy curtains, wool batting, even egg crates, which some residents apparently used to line their walls. Several orders were placed for phonographs and musical cylinders, despite their considerable expense. Interviews with descendants of survivors suggest these were used not for entertainment, but to mask conversation, creating background noise to prevent private discussions from being heard and potentially repeated. The winter isolation might explain some behavioral changes, but not the collective silence that descended on Blackwood Junction. Residents began covering mirrors, stuffing rags under doors, and hanging thick curtains over windows. Several accounts mention people would speak only in whispers, if at all, believing that voices spoken aloud would return later from the darkness. The town's lone telephone operator, Harriet Wilcox, noted in her logbook that calls dropped precipitously in January. When people did use the telephone, their conversations were cryptic and brief. Several refused to speak at all, using a system of taps to communicate. 1 tap for yes, 2 for no, patterns for simple messages. According to Wilcox's notes, this was due to a growing belief that the telephone wires carried voices too far into places where something might be listening. What happened to Edgar Blackwood, patriarch of the founding family, exemplifies the psychological terror that gripped the town. A wealthy industrialist who had established the mining operation in 1876, Blackwood lived in a mansion overlooking the town. His personal physician, Dr. Morrison, who replaced Garfield, noted in his medical log that Blackwood began experiencing auditory disruptions in mid-January. Before his own troubles began, Blackwood had remained skeptical of the town's growing hysteria. In letters to business associates in Louisville, he described the situation as a regrettable mass delusion, likely triggered by the difficult winter and the unfortunate disappearance of Dr. Garfield. He even hosted a dinner party on January 7th, inviting the town's remaining officials and prominent citizens. According to Morrison's notes, only 3 people attended, and the evening was marked by strained silence, interrupted by the host's increasingly desperate attempts at conversation. The log, discovered during a renovation of the county courthouse in 1951, describes how Blackwood initially complained of hearing mining operations at night, though the mine had been closed since an accident the previous summer. These complaints escalated to hearing board meetings he'd conducted years earlier, complete with voices of partners who had died or left the region. Morrison's records become increasingly detailed as Blackwood's condition deteriorated. The industrialist reported that the replayed conversations began to include questions he had never asked and answers he had never given. Business discussions morphed into personal matters, secrets Blackwood claimed never to have uttered aloud. Most distressingly, he began hearing conversations between himself and his deceased wife, discussing events that had occurred after her death. Morrison prescribed laudanum for sleep and suggested Blackwood leave town temporarily. Blackwood refused. His final journal entry, dated January 28, 1903, reads simply, "They are not echoes. They are rehearsals." Among Blackwood's papers, discovered decades later in a bank vault in Louisville, was a sealed envelope containing what appeared to be transcripts of conversations. The handwriting matches Blackwood's known script, but the content is bizarre. Dialogues between Blackwood and various townspeople discussing events that had not yet occurred at the time of writing. These include detailed descriptions of spring flooding that would indeed affect the region in April 1903, references to the Spanish-American War that contained details not public until years later, and most disturbingly, accurate accounts of how and when certain residents would die, including some who disappeared that winter. The final pages are increasingly incoherent, with multiple versions of Blackwood's handwriting overlapping on the same page, as if different versions of himself were attempting to communicate simultaneously. The last legible phrase, written in a hand barely recognizable as Blackwood's, reads, "I hear myself planning this from the mine. I've been practicing me." He disappeared the following night. The mansion was found immaculate. No signs of struggle or forced entry. The only anomaly was that every timepiece in the house, from grandfather clocks to pocket watches, had stopped at 3:27 a.m. According to the household staff, the mansion felt wrong afterward. The cook described it as a place where the air itself was listening. What's particularly notable about Blackwood's disappearance is how little attention it received outside the town. Despite his prominence in Kentucky business circles, his absence went unremarked in Louisville and Lexington newspapers. Inquiries from business partners were reportedly answered with letters explaining that Blackwood had traveled abroad for health reasons. These letters, when examined decades later, proved to be forgeries, though the handwriting was indistinguishable from Blackwood's own. The investigation into Blackwood's disappearance was more thorough than Garfield's had been. State authorities were notified. Records from the Kentucky State Police indicate a Detective James Monroe arrived on February 3rd to investigate. His initial reports described the town as pathologically silent and noted that residents appeared uniformly haggard and unwilling to maintain eye contact. Monroe's personal journal, which was not included in official records but was preserved by his widow and later donated to the State Historical Society, provides a more candid assessment of the situation. His entry from February 4th reads, "Something is profoundly wrong in Blackwood Junction. The residents move like sleepwalkers. They watch me when they think I'm not looking, but won't meet my gaze directly. They speak as little as possible, and when they do, they whisper or write notes they immediately destroy. They seem not afraid of each other, but of themselves, of what might come out of their own mouths. I've never seen fear like this." Monroe's investigation centered on the abandoned mine. His reports detail an unusual discovery. Despite being shut down for months, the mine entrance showed signs of recent activity. Boot prints led both in and out, though they matched no residents' footwear. More disturbing were the handprints found on the support beams. Handprints that Monroe noted were positioned as if someone had been dragged into the darkness while trying to resist. In his journal, Monroe described his examination of the mine entrance. The prints are peculiar, almost but not quite human. The stride length is inconsistent, as if whatever made them was unused to walking. And there's a deliberateness to them, each print placed with unnatural precision, like a child practicing steps. The handprints trouble me more. They begin at adult height, but drag downward, growing more frantic. Several fingers appear to have broken during the struggle, leaving smears rather than prints toward the end. The detective requested permission to explore the mine shaft, but was denied by state authorities, who cited structural concerns. Private correspondence between Monroe and his superior, preserved in the state archives, reveals his frustration. Something is happening in Blackwood Junction that defies rational explanation. The residents know more than they're saying, but they've developed a pathological fear of speaking. I believe this community is suffering from a shared psychosis triggered by isolation and possibly exacerbated by environmental factors. Monroe's journal entries become increasingly concerned with his own experiences as the investigation continued. He began recording instances of hearing conversations repeated, discussions he had with townspeople echoing from empty rooms hours later. He noted waking at exactly 3:27 a.m., 3 nights in a row, feeling observed by something in the room's darkest corner. Most troubling was his growing conviction that his own voice no longer sounded right to his ears, that something in its timbre had changed. Monroe never filed his final report. According to the last telegram he sent to headquarters on February 12th, he planned one final interview with the town schoolmaster, who claimed to have information about what the mine took. Monroe was never seen again. His horse was found grazing calmly outside the schoolhouse, his notebook open on the teacher's desk. The pages were blank. What's particularly disturbing about Monroe's disappearance is the testimony of Abigail Winters, the schoolmaster's elderly mother. In a statement given to the state police, she claimed to have observed Monroe approach the schoolhouse at exactly 4:15 p.m. According to her account, he tied his horse outside, straightened his hat, and entered the building. 17 minutes later, she saw him exit again, mount his horse, and ride toward the mine. When investigators pointed out that his horse had been found still tied at the schoolhouse, she became agitated, insisting she had seen what she had seen. It was him, her statement reads, but not quite right. He walked too careful, like he was learning how. Mrs. Winters' statement includes another detail that investigators initially dismissed, but gains significance in light of the broader pattern. She claimed that as Monroe rode away, she clearly heard his voice from inside the schoolhouse, engaged in conversation with her son. 2 voices, she insisted, both the detectives, but having different conversations in different rooms. The schoolmaster himself, Jonathan Winters, was found in the school cellar, hiding in a coal bin. When discovered, he was engaged in what appeared to be a conversation with himself, whispering questions, and then answering in a slightly different tone. He resisted being removed from the cellar and became violent when forced to leave. During his transport to the state hospital in Lexington, he escaped by jumping from the moving train. Despite an extensive search, he was never found. A railroad worker reported seeing a man matching Winters' description walking calmly along the tracks toward Blackwood Junction hours after his escape. But this sighting was never confirmed. The state police sent 2 more detectives to investigate Monroe's disappearance. They reported finding the town depopulated, though no evacuation had been ordered or reported. Approximately 30 residents remained, all claiming the others had moved on for better opportunities. Those who stayed appeared, in the words of Detective Franklin Reed, resigned to whatever fate awaited them. Reed's official reports maintain a professional detachment, presenting observations without speculation. His private letters to his wife, however, preserved in her family collection and made available to researchers in 1987, reveal growing unease. He described residents who seemed emptied out, not just frightened or withdrawn, but somehow incomplete. He noted the town's unnatural quiet, writing that even the usual sounds of habitation, footsteps, doors closing, dishes clinking, are absent, as if people are making a conscious effort to move without sound. Most disturbing was his account of interviewing remaining residents. They answer questions mechanically, with phrases that sound rehearsed. When pressed for details, they repeat themselves exactly, using identical words and gestures, as if they've learned a script but can't improvise beyond it. Their eyes remain fixed on points just over my shoulder, as if they're watching for something I can't see. The most disturbing account comes from Reed's partner, Detective Samuel Porter, who documented a strange incident during their second night in town. While staying at the boarding house, Porter reported waking to find his partner standing motionless at the window, staring toward the mine. When Porter spoke to him, Reed didn't respond. According to Porter's report, Reed finally turned and said, "They're coming back wrong," before returning to bed. Reed had no recollection of the incident the next morning. Porter's personal journal, discovered among his effects after his death in 1945 and now held in the Kentucky State Police Museum, elaborates on this incident. Reed's face was wrong somehow. Slack in a way I've never seen on a conscious person. His eyes tracked my movement, but showed no recognition. When he spoke, the words came too slowly, with unnatural pauses between them, as if he were translating from another language. I asked him what he meant. He turned back to the window and said, "They practice us until they get it right." He then returned to his bed with a stiff, careful gait, unlike his usual stride. This morning he remembers nothing, but something has changed. He doesn't sound quite like himself anymore. The detective's investigation centered on interviewing the remaining residents, who provided contradictory and often nonsensical accounts of the previous weeks. Several mentioned hearing the wrong voices saying the right things. Others refused to speak at all, communicating only through written notes that they immediately burned after being read. One interview with former mine foreman George Latimer was particularly revealing. Latimer, who had worked in the mine for 22 years before the collapse, initially refused to speak at all. When Porter insisted, Latimer wrote a note. "They learn from hearing us. They're better at it now." When asked to explain, Latimer reluctantly whispered, "It started in the new tunnel. We broke through into something hollow, bigger than it should have been. The echo was wrong there, too clear, too precise, like something was catching our words and holding them. Then they started coming back changed." Latimer claimed the miners had encountered a natural cavity deep within the mountain, a space that should have been solid rock, but instead was empty in a way that felt wrong. He described how voices in this chamber would return not as simple echoes, but as responses, often incorporating words spoken days earlier in completely different contexts. Several miners reported hearing their own private conversations repeated in this space, including discussions that had occurred at home, far from the mine. Most disturbing was Latimer's claim that some miners began hearing versions of themselves discussing accidents that had not yet happened, accurate premonitions of cave-ins or equipment failures. "After a while," he whispered, "we realized it wasn't predicting accidents. It was planning them." The mine itself became the focus of local superstition. Residents avoided looking directly at the entrance, which was visible from the town's main street. Several had boarded up windows facing that direction. The local minister, Reverend Hollister, began preaching that the mine was a mouth that should be sewn shut. His sermons, transcribed by his wife and preserved in the church records, speak of words that return changed and voices that learn from listening. Hollister's theological interpretation of events evolved over the winter months. Initial sermons framed the phenomena as divine tests or possibly demonic influence. By January, his rhetoric had shifted to something more unusual, describing the mine as a place where the fabric between is worn thin and warning that what listens from that hollow is neither divine nor demonic, but something outside such categories altogether. It learns, it imitates, and eventually it replaces. His final sermon, delivered to a nearly empty church on February 1st, abandoned religious framework entirely. The transcript reads more like a warning. It begins with your voice, because that's the easiest part of you to capture, the part that extends beyond your body, into the world. Once it has your voice, it studies how you move, how you think, how you respond. It practices being you, and when it's confident, it steps into your place. The body remains as a shell, moving through familiar patterns, but what animates it is no longer the person you knew. Hollister and his wife disappeared 3 days later. Their home was found in perfect order, a cold breakfast still on the table. The only anomaly was a partial transcript of a sermon in Hollister's handwriting, discussing events that had not yet occurred, including a detailed description of investigators finding his abandoned home. Reed and Porter eventually requested permission to seal the mine entrance. State authorities, concerned about valuable equipment still inside, initially refused. The detectives' increasingly urgent telegrams, however, eventually convinced them. On February 22, 1903, a controlled explosion collapsed the mine entrance. Porter's report indicates the collapse was met with no celebration from townspeople, only a collective exhalation, as if the town had been holding its breath for months. The relief was short-lived. That night, according to multiple witness statements, every resident reported hearing a clear, distinct knocking, 3 slow raps from inside their homes. The sounds came from walls, floors, ceilings, seemingly everywhere and nowhere. Several residents fled that night, leaving behind everything they owned. What's particularly noteworthy about the exodus is how it was conducted. According to Porter's report, those who fled did so in absolute silence. No calls to family members, no shouted instructions, no crying or expressions of panic. They simply walked out of their homes and away from town, carrying nothing, speaking to no one. Several walked right past Porter without acknowledging him, their expressions blank, yet purposeful. He described them as moving like sleepwalkers, with somewhere specific to be. Porter observed another disturbing pattern. Those who left walked not toward the main road or nearby towns, but toward the collapsed mine entrance. His attempts to redirect several residents failed. They simply walked around him and continued their journey. He followed one woman for nearly a mile before she disappeared into the tree line near the mine. Search parties the next day found no trace of those who had fled. Those who remained began behaving even more strangely. Reed documented several instances of residents appearing to have conversations with empty chairs, moving their lips but producing no sound. Others would freeze in mid-motion, remaining absolutely still for minutes at a time before continuing as if nothing had happened. The town doctor, Morrison, began diagnosing these episodes as temporal fugues, moments where, he claimed, the mind steps briefly outside of time. Reed observed that these episodes often occurred simultaneously among multiple residents, as if coordinated. In one instance, he documented 5 people in different locations around town freezing at precisely the same moment, remaining motionless for exactly 7 minutes, and then resuming activity as if nothing had happened. When questioned, none reported any awareness of the pause. Morrison's medical records from this period show a preoccupation with silence as a diagnostic tool. He began requiring patients to sit in complete silence for 10 minutes before he would examine them, claiming this allowed him to hear what's really wrong. His notes become increasingly erratic through February, filled with observations like, Mrs. Thornton's cough has a conversational rhythm, and Judge Williams's pulse is asking questions. Most disturbing was Morrison's growing conviction that diseases themselves were forms of communication, that symptoms were messages from elsewhere, using the human body as a medium. His treatment protocols began to include acoustic isolation for patients whom he would place in specially constructed chambers lined with sound-absorbing materials. According to his notes, this was to prevent the illness from hearing itself and learning how to evolve. By March, Blackwood Junction had fewer than 20 residents. Those who remained rarely ventured outdoors and never spoke above a whisper. The Postal Service stopped delivering mail after the postmistress left without notice, her office locked from the inside with no sign of her within. The general store operated on an honor system. Customers would take what they needed and leave payment without the proprietor ever showing himself. Reed and Porter's reports from this period document a community in profound psychological distress. Residents had developed elaborate systems to avoid making sound, wrapping doorknobs in cloth, wearing multiple layers of socks instead of shoes, communicating through gesture and written notes. Many had taken to wearing scarves or high collars that obscured their mouths, even indoors. The psychological state of the remaining residents deteriorated rapidly. Dr. Morrison's medical log shows increasing cases of extreme insomnia, paranoia, and what he termed echophasia, a condition where patients would only communicate by repeating what was said to them, as if afraid to generate original speech. Morrison's own mental state declined precipitously in early March. His medical notes, initially clinical and organized, devolved into rambling observations about acoustic infections and mimetic contagions. He became convinced that something was using sound itself as a vector, that the human voice could be colonized by an external entity. His final entries describe attempts to develop a vocal vaccine, having patients listen to recordings of their own voices played backward, which he believed would confuse the mimics. The most detailed account from this period comes from Margaret Weston, a nurse who arrived from Lexington to assist Dr. Morrison. Her journal, discovered in 1957 in the Kentucky Medical Historical Society archives, describes a community in the grip of collective psychosis. Residents would freeze at unexpected sounds. Some had taken to walking only on carpeted areas to avoid making footsteps. Most disturbing was their habit of mouthing words without vocalizing them, communicating through exaggerated lip movements while remaining completely silent. Weston's observations about the physical changes in residents are particularly unsettling. She noted that many appeared to have lost significant weight, not from lack of food, but from what she described as a hollowing out. Their skin hung loosely, their eyes seemed deeper set, their voices, when they used them, had a resonant quality she compared to speaking into an empty barrel. She began to suspect some form of wasting disease until she noticed that certain residents appeared to be regaining weight and vitality at night, only to return to their hollowed state by morning. Her journal entries from mid-March document a growing concern that the residents were not actually sleeping. She observed lights moving in houses throughout the night, shadows passing windows at odd hours, and reported hearing what sounded like conversations at 3:27 a.m., always at that precise time, though the voices were too faint to make out words. When she questioned residents, they insisted they had slept soundly and alone, despite Weston having clearly seen multiple moving shadows in their homes. Her journal entries grow increasingly concerned about Dr. Morrison, who had begun what he called acoustic treatments. These involved placing patients in the root cellar beneath his office for hours at a time, claiming the perfect silence would reset their inner voices. Patients emerged disoriented and even more reluctant to speak. One patient, whom Weston identifies only as Mr. H., emerged from treatment unable or unwilling to speak at all. When she examined him, she found his vocal cords appeared to be functioning normally, but he responded to questions by writing. "I gave it my voice. It was the only way to make it stop." Weston's professional skepticism gradually eroded as she experienced increasingly inexplicable phenomena herself. She documented hearing her own voice reciting patient notes in rooms she had just left, seeing her reflection in mirrors continue moving after she had stopped, and, most disturbingly, finding pages in her journal filled with her handwriting describing events that had not yet happened. One entry, dated March 17th, but apparently written earlier, detailed with perfect accuracy a conversation she would have with Morrison on that date, including phrases and observations she had never considered before reading them in her own handwriting. "It's as if," she wrote, "something else is using my hand, my words, my thoughts, but from hours or days ahead of when I actually experience them." Weston lasted 2 weeks before fleeing. Her final journal entry describes waking to find Morrison standing over her bed, silently mouthing words she couldn't understand. When she asked what he wanted, he placed a finger to his lips and wrote on a piece of paper, "They're learning to imitate us. Don't give them your voice." The following morning, Morrison was gone. His home was undisturbed except for a peculiar detail. Every reflective surface had been covered with black cloth. What Weston didn't include in her journal, but later confided to a colleague at the Lexington Hospital, according to a letter found in the colleague's personal effects after her death, was that she had been experiencing auditory phenomena herself before fleeing. She described waking in the night to hear her own voice reciting patient notes she had recorded earlier, though the phonograph she used to record them was not playing. More disturbing, she claimed to hear her own voice speaking phrases she had only thought but never said aloud. This progression, from hearing one's own voice repeat spoken words to hearing thoughts that had never been vocalized, appears repeatedly in accounts from Blackwood Junction. It suggests whatever was learning from residents was becoming more sophisticated in its mimicry, moving from simple repetition to more complex forms of simulation. April brought spring to Kentucky, but no renewal to Blackwood Junction. The remaining residents began reporting a phenomenon more disturbing than the voices. They described seeing themselves in places they hadn't been, glimpsed through windows, around corners, always at a distance, always just for a moment. Sheriff Harding, one of the few officials who remained, documented these sightings in his official log, noting that they followed a pattern. Residents would see their doppelgangers 3 times before disappearing themselves. Harding's log entries from early April attempt to maintain an objective tone, documenting each reported sighting with time, location, and witness statements. By April 7th, the entries become more personal. Harding himself reported seeing his double standing at the edge of the forest at 4:17 p.m. His log entry is clinical, detailing the time, the exact location, and the fact that the figure was wearing his winter coat though the day was mild. Harding's description is disturbing in its precision. He noted that his doppelganger stood too still, maintaining a posture that would be difficult for a living person to hold. When Harding called out, the figure turned with mechanical deliberateness, rotating its head first, then its torso in a separate motion. It made no response but observed him for several minutes before stepping backward into the tree line and vanishing. Harding reported finding no footprints or disturbed vegetation where it had stood. His second sighting came on April 12th. This time his double was closer, standing in the middle of the town square at dusk, facing the mine. In this encounter, the doppelganger was wearing Harding's sheriff's uniform and badge. Harding reported that when he approached, the figure began to speak, not to him, but as if practicing speech. "It cycled through greetings and common phrases," he wrote, "using my voice but with subtle variations in inflection, as if testing different emotional tones. 'Good morning. How are you today?' 'Fine weather we're having.'" Each repeated several times with slight adjustments. What Harding found most unnerving was not the duplication of his appearance or voice, but the sense that the doppelganger was practicing being me, rehearsing human interaction like an actor preparing for a role. When he drew his revolver, the figure displayed no fear or concern, merely tilting its head like a curious bird before walking away with movements that seemed almost but not quite right, as if working from observation rather than innate understanding. The final entry in Harding's log, dated April A, contains just one line. "He's standing outside my window now, wearing my badge. He's waited long enough." Harding's badge was found on his desk the next morning. He was never seen again. What's particularly disturbing about Harding's case is the testimony of Joseph Miller, one of the few townspeople still willing to speak to outsiders. In a statement given to county officials who briefly investigated in late April, Miller claimed to have seen Harding walking toward the mine the morning after his disappearance. Miller, assuming the sheriff had returned, called out to him. According to his statement, Harding turned, nodded, but didn't speak. Miller described feeling immediately uneasy, though he couldn't articulate why. "It was Harding," he stated, "but he moved wrong, too deliberate, like he was thinking about each step in his eyes. They were watching me, but nothing was behind them." Miller's statement includes a detail that investigators initially dismissed, but takes on greater significance in light of later events. He claimed that as Harding walked away, he noticed that the sheriff's footsteps made no sound despite his heavy boots and the gravel road. When Miller looked down, he saw that Harding's feet weren't quite touching the ground. The county investigation was brief and inconclusive. Officials attributed the multiple disappearances and bizarre accounts to mountain fever and possibly contaminated water. Their report recommended abandoning the settlement due to unsuitable living conditions. No mention was made of the acoustic phenomena or the doppelganger sightings, despite multiple witness statements describing both. By May 1903, Blackwood Junction was officially abandoned. The county listed it as economically non-viable, and no effort was made to resettle the area. The buildings remained, slowly decaying over the decades. The mine entrance, despite being collapsed, was reinforced with concrete in 1927 under the authorization of the state governor, though no official explanation was recorded. The authorization for the reinforcement came after a series of unusual incidents in the region. Hunters reported hearing conversations emanating from the collapsed mine entrance, conversations and voices they recognized from town residents who had disappeared years earlier. More disturbing were reports from nearby communities that former Blackwood Junction residents had been seen returning to the abandoned town, often at night, walking in a trance-like state toward the mine. A state ranger tasked with monitoring the area in 1926-27 kept a detailed log of these returns. He documented 17 instances over an 8-month period, noting that the returnees displayed common characteristics, moving with unusual stiffness, never speaking, and traveling only after sunset. His attempts to intercept several were unsuccessful. The figures would change direction to avoid him, always maintaining their trajectory toward the mine, circling around obstacles if necessary. The ranger's most disturbing observation was that these returning figures left no footprints, even in soft ground, and seemed unaffected by environmental conditions. One elderly woman he observed walking toward the mine during a heavy rainstorm remained completely dry, despite having no umbrella or coat. When he shouted at her, she turned to look at him with what he described as perfect emptiness, eyes as vacant as glass marbles, before continuing her journey. The concrete seal was designed not just to prevent entry into the mine, but according to private correspondence between the governor and the project engineer, to prevent sound transmission in either direction. The engineer's reports indicate that special acoustic dampening materials were incorporated into the concrete mixture, an unusual and expensive addition that was not disclosed in public records. The project faced unexpected difficulties. Workers reported tools disappearing, only to be found arranged in careful patterns, deeper in the mine shaft. Several complained of hearing their conversations repeated back to them hours later from deeper in the tunnel. Most concerning were reports that the work itself seemed to be undone overnight. Concrete poured one day would be found excavated the next morning, though no signs of human activity were evident. The project foreman, David Harker, reported another disturbing phenomenon: workers beginning to mimic each other's speech patterns and mannerisms, sometimes appearing to fall into synchronized movements without awareness. In his final report, submitted after the project's completion, Harker recommended that all workers be reassigned to different projects in different parts of the state to minimize any lingering effects of their time at Blackwood Junction. He himself resigned from state employment entirely, reportedly moving to California and changing his name. The story might have ended there, another ghost town in America's industrial past, had it not been for Dr. Elias Chambers, a psychology professor from the University of Kentucky, who developed an interest in the case in 1961. Chambers discovered the scattered records and began interviewing relatives of former Blackwood Junction residents. What he found suggested the horror hadn't ended with the town's abandonment. Former residents who had fled Blackwood Junction reported continuing to hear their own voices at odd hours, sometimes repeating conversations they'd had years after leaving the town. Several lived in complete silence, communicating only through writing. Others would speak only during certain hours of the day, maintaining rigid silence from sunset to sunrise. One interview subject, Henry Collins, son of Deputy Michael Collins, described his father's decades-long behaviors following his escape from Blackwood Junction. The elder Collins had moved his family to Cincinnati, refusing to discuss what had happened in the mining town. According to his son, Collins maintained elaborate rituals to confuse the listeners, as he called them, never sleeping in the same room twice in a row, speaking in code phrases with family members, and most notably, recording his own voice on primitive recording devices and then playing these recordings in empty rooms of the house while he remained silent elsewhere. Most disturbing were the reports of doppelgangers. At least 7 former residents reported seeing themselves in public places, standing across streets, sitting in restaurants, watching from train platforms. In each case, the double would appear 3 times, each time closer than before. After the third sighting, the person would feel an overwhelming compulsion to return to Blackwood Junction. 3 did return, according to family members. None were ever seen again. The pattern of returns extended beyond the immediate survivors. Chambers documented cases of children and even grandchildren of Blackwood Junction residents experiencing similar phenomena, hearing voices of relatives they had never met, seeing doppelgangers of themselves, and feeling drawn to the abandoned town site despite having never been told of its significance. This generational effect suggested something more complex than simple trauma or shared psychosis. Chambers' investigation took a darker turn when he began experiencing unusual phenomena himself. In notes discovered after his disappearance, he described waking to hear his own voice speaking from his study, reciting passages from interviews he had conducted. Recording devices he set up to capture these occurrences never recorded anything unusual, yet the phenomena persisted. More unsettling was his growing conviction that he was being watched during his research. His notes described the sensation of focused attention, particularly when reviewing certain documents or discussing specific aspects of the case. He began to suspect that the act of investigation itself was somehow activating whatever had affected Blackwood Junction. This suspicion seemed confirmed when he played back research recordings and discovered segments of silence where he distinctly remembered speaking. In one particularly disturbing incident, he played a recording of an interview with a former resident's daughter, only to hear his own voice asking questions he didn't recall asking, in phrasings he would never use. His research assistant, graduate student Carolyn Weber, documented her own concerns about Chambers' behavior in a private journal discovered after her death in 1997. She described subtle changes in his speech patterns and mannerisms over the course of the investigation, nothing dramatic, but noticeable to someone who worked closely with him. Most concerning was his growing preoccupation with the acoustic properties of the human voice. He began recording his own voice daily, analyzing the recordings for what he called infiltration markers, subtle changes in tone, rhythm, or vocabulary that might indicate external influence. Chambers compiled his research into a monograph titled collective psychosis in isolated communities, the Blackwood Junction incident. The manuscript was submitted to the Journal of Abnormal Psychology in 1962, but was rejected for publication. Chambers appealed, but before the appeal could be heard, he withdrew the paper and resigned his position at the university. His colleague, Dr. Martin Greaves, later claimed that Chambers had received a package containing a phonograph cylinder. After listening to it, Chambers burned all his research notes and refused to discuss Blackwood Junction again. According to Greaves, Chambers' final words on the subject were, "It isn't finished. It's still listening. And now it's heard me too." What Greaves didn't reveal until years later in a private letter to the university president, sealed until after Greaves's death, was that he had heard the phonograph recording as well. He described it as 87 seconds of perfect silence, followed by Chambers' voice saying words he had spoken during a private conversation we had had in my office the previous day, a conversation no one else had heard and that had not been recorded by any device. Greaves's letter continued. What disturbed me more than the impossibility of this recording was Chambers' reaction to it. He listened without surprise, as if confirming something he already suspected. When the recording ended, he smiled in a way I had never seen before, a smile that seemed practiced rather than natural. He said, "Now you've heard it too," in a tone that suggested he had planned this moment. I have not spoken with Elias since that day, but twice now I have seen someone who looks exactly like him watching my home from across the street. When I approach, the figure walks away with a stiffness that reminds me of how Elias described the movements of the Blackwood Junction doppelgangers. Chambers moved to Arizona and lived as a recluse until his death in 1968. His death certificate lists the cause as heart failure, but the attending physician noted that Chambers died with his eyes and mouth wide open in an expression of profound terror. An unusual footnote to Chambers' story emerged in 1965, when a graduate student working in the university archives discovered a sealed envelope Chambers had left before his departure. The envelope contained a single page with a list of names, all former residents of Blackwood Junction who had fled during the winter of 1903. Next to each name was a date. When the student cross-referenced these dates, she discovered each corresponded exactly to when that person had died or disappeared. The final entry on the list was Elias Chambers, with the date March 17, 1968, nearly 3 years in the future at the time Chambers wrote it. He did indeed die on that exact date. More disturbing was a notation at the bottom of the page in handwriting that matched Chambers, but displayed subtle differences in character formation. Time means nothing to them. They exist in all moments at once. They've always been in the mine. They've always been in me. They've always been in you, too. The land where Blackwood Junction once stood was purchased by the state of Kentucky in 1970 and designated as part of a wildlife preserve. Access is restricted ostensibly for environmental conservation. The concrete seal over the mine entrance is inspected annually by state engineers, though this fact appears in no public records and was only discovered through a Freedom of Information request filed in 1982. The inspection reports contain a disturbing pattern. Each year, despite no visible damage, acoustic and structural tests indicate the seal is somehow becoming thinner from the inside. The material isn't eroding, it's being compressed, as if under enormous pressure. Engineers have repeatedly recommended reinforcement, but these recommendations are consistently deferred. More disturbing are the sound tests. Highly sensitive equipment placed against the seal has detected what the reports describe as ambient noise consistent with distant conversation, despite the mine being sealed for decades. One report, later redacted from official records but preserved in an engineer's personal files, noted that the acoustic signature matched human speech patterns, but at frequencies impossible for human vocal cords to produce. The most recent documented incident connected to Blackwood Junction occurred in 1967, when a graduate student named Thomas Mercer discovered Chambers' original research notes, which had been misfiled in the university archives rather than destroyed. Mercer reportedly became obsessed with the case and traveled to the former town site despite the access restrictions. Park rangers found his car abandoned near the old road leading to Blackwood Junction. A search party was organized, but found no trace of Mercer. His recorder was discovered near the concrete seal of the mine, still running, the tape completely played through. When rewound and played back, the tape contained only 87 minutes of silence, followed by 3 distinct knocks, followed by Mercer's voice saying, "I understand now, they just wanted to be heard." No further investigation was conducted. Mercer's disappearance was attributed to misadventure in restricted wilderness. His case was closed in 1968. What the official report doesn't mention is that 3 weeks after Mercer's disappearance, a park ranger reported seeing someone matching Mercer's description walking along the old town's main street at dusk. When the ranger called out, the figure didn't respond but turned slowly to face him. The ranger, in his unofficial account shared years later with a local newspaper reporter, said the face was Mercer's, but empty somehow, like a photograph of a person rather than the person themselves. The ranger approached, but the figure retreated into the ruins of a building. When the ranger followed, he found the building empty, with no other exits. More disturbing was his discovery that the building's floorboards were covered with a fine layer of undisturbed dust that showed no footprints other than his own. The ranger requested a transfer the following day and never returned to that section of the preserve. The remaining physical evidence of the Blackwood Junction incident is scant. The town itself has been reclaimed by forest. The county records have been scattered across various archives, many lost in administrative reorganizations and courthouse renovations. The few photographs that exist show only a typical mining town of the period, nothing to suggest the psychological horror that unfolded there. What makes the Blackwood Junction case so disturbing is not what was seen, but what was heard, and how what was heard transformed a community. It suggests something predatory about silence itself, as if the absence of sound creates a vacuum that something else might fill. The phenomenon of returned voices, of hearing oneself speak from somewhere else, of words coming back changed, represents a profound violation of the boundary between self and other. Our voices are extensions of ourselves, carrying our thoughts into the world. What happened in Blackwood Junction suggests those extensions can be captured, studied, and returned wrong. Modern psychologists who have studied the fragmentary records suggest the town experienced a form of mass hysteria, exacerbated by winter isolation and possibly toxic exposure from the mine. This clinical explanation fails to account for the pattern of disappearances, the documentation by outside observers like Detective Monroe, or the continued experiences of those who fled. A more unsettling theory emerged in 1982 when Dr. Henrietta Klein, a linguistics professor specializing in acoustic properties of human speech, reviewed the case while researching a book on regional dialects. Her analysis focused on the phenomenon of returned voices and the specific pattern of how they changed over time, first echoes, then responses, then anticipations. Klein proposed that what the residents experienced might be understood as a form of linguistic predation, something learning human communication, not by imitation, but by consumption. Her theory suggests that whatever dwelled in the mine didn't just mimic voices, but somehow extracted them, processed them, and eventually learned to generate them independently. This theory might explain why residents began to avoid speaking. It wasn't just fear of being heard, but fear of being, in a sense, consumed, having a fundamental aspect of their identity extracted and repurposed. The progression from hearing echoes to seeing doppelgangers follows a logical pattern, from capturing expressions to capturing physical presence. Klein never published her analysis. Her research notes end abruptly in mid-sentence. Colleagues reported that she abandoned the project after receiving an unmarked package containing an antique phonograph cylinder. The cylinder was never found among her possessions after she abruptly relocated to New Zealand in 1983, breaking contact with academic colleagues and family alike. Whatever happened in Blackwood Junction in the winter of 1903 altered something fundamental in how its residents perceived reality. It made them doubt the most basic assumptions about identity and presence. It taught them to fear their own voices, not for what those voices said, but for what might be listening, learning, and eventually responding. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the case is how thoroughly it has been forgotten. No historical markers identify the town site. Local histories mention it only in passing, if at all. Even descendants of the residents rarely know the story, as if the silence that consumed Blackwood Junction continues to spread outward through time, erasing even the memory of what happened there. Those who have studied the case in depth often report a peculiar experience, the feeling of being overheard while reading the documents, as if the act of learning about Blackwood Junction attracts attention from something that is still listening. Several researchers have reported hearing their own voices at odd hours after becoming involved with the case, usually repeating phrases they used while discussing their findings. In 1964, one of the last surviving former residents of Blackwood Junction, Martha Kendrick, agreed to a recorded interview with a journalist from the Louisville Courier-Journal. Then 78, Kendrick had been a young woman of 17 when she fled the town in February 1903. For 6 decades, she had never spoken of what happened there. The recording exists in the newspaper's archives, though it has never been published. Kendrick speaks haltingly, often pausing for long periods. When asked directly about the voices, she falls silent for nearly 3 minutes before responding. They weren't echoes, they were learning. First, they learned to repeat. Then, they learned to respond. Then, they learned to anticipate. By the end, they knew what you were going to say before you said it. They knew what you were going to do before you did it. They knew you better than you knew yourself. When asked what they were, Kendrick's response is barely audible on the recording. Hungry spaces, empty places that wanted to be filled. The mine was the deepest one, but there are others, there are always others. Places that have been hollowed out and left empty. They resonate. And when you speak near them, they keep a part of you. They hold it and study it and send it back, changed. The interview ends abruptly when Kendrick refuses to continue, saying only, "I've given it too much already. It remembers voices, and now it's heard mine again." She died 3 days later. The coroner's report indicates natural causes, but the attending nurse noted that in her final moments, Kendrick appeared to be listening intently to something no one else could hear. What's perhaps most disturbing about Kendrick's testimony is how it aligns with folklore from the region that predates the mining operation. Appalachian oral traditions include numerous references to hollow places, where echoes return changed. These were typically avoided, especially by singers and storytellers, who believed that performing near such places might result in losing one's voice, or worse, hearing it speak without one's volition. The Cherokee who inhabited the region before European settlement had similar taboos regarding certain caves and deep crevices, places they called speaking holes. Their traditions warned that speaking too much near these places would allow something to learn your voice and steal your face. These locations were marked and avoided, particularly during winter months, when it was believed the entities dwelling within were most active due to the relative silence of the natural world. The last official record relating to Blackwood Junction is a state engineering report from 1969, assessing the structural integrity of the concrete seal over the mine entrance. The report notes that despite no visible damage, acoustic tests indicated the seal had been compromised from the inside. The engineers recommended reinforcement, which was completed later that year. A handwritten note on the report's margin, initialed by the chief engineer, reads simply, "Fill it completely, whatever the cost." The recommendation was never implemented. Budget constraints were cited. The engineer who wrote that note, Raymond Caulfield, retired the following year and moved to Oregon. In 1972, he contacted a former colleague expressing concern that he had been hearing things. According to the colleague's recollection, shared during a 1985 interview with a paranormal researcher, Caulfield claimed to hear his own voice at night, reciting the technical specifications of the concrete seal, specifications he had spoken aloud only while at the mine site. Caulfield later reported seeing himself standing at the foot of his bed, watching him sleep. The figure appeared 3 times, each time closer. After the third appearance, Caulfield told his wife he needed to return to take care of something. He purchased a ticket to Kentucky but never boarded the plane. His rental car was found abandoned near the wildlife preserve. He was never seen again. What happened in Blackwood Junction remains a mystery that few have heard, and fewer have investigated. Those who dig too deeply often abandon their research abruptly. Academic inquiries are discouraged. The land remains restricted. But occasionally, hikers in the wildlife preserve report a peculiar phenomenon. In certain areas, especially near dusk, their voices sound different to their own ears, as if returning from a great distance, or as if someone else is speaking simultaneously with them, using their words, but with slightly different inflections. Park rangers dismiss these reports. They attribute them to unusual acoustic properties in the heavily forested terrain. They advise hikers to stay on marked trails and to be back before dark. They never mention Blackwood Junction. They never speak its name, and perhaps that silence is the most telling response of all. For in Blackwood Junction, Kentucky, in the winter of 1903, something learned to listen, and by all indications it hasn't stopped. In 2002, a hiker who had become separated from his group reported a strange encounter near the Old Town site. He described finding himself in a clearing where building foundations were still visible beneath the undergrowth. As the sun began to set, he heard what sounded like voices coming from the ground beneath him, normal conversations, mundane exchanges, but with a quality he described as faded, like old photographs of sound. More disturbing was his description of what happened when he called out for his companions. His voice returned to him not as a simple echo but transformed, first as a perfect repetition, then as a response using his words but rearranged, then finally as a new sentence in his voice that seemed to anticipate what he was going to say next. The hiker reported feeling an overwhelming sensation of being hollowed out as this occurred, as if each time his voice returned it came back having taken something from him. He fled the area in growing panic, eventually finding his way back to the marked trail. Park officials dismissed his account, suggesting he had experienced auditory hallucinations due to dehydration. The incident report was filed and forgotten. The hiker, however, reportedly developed a selective mutism in the weeks following the incident, speaking only when absolutely necessary and never above a whisper. Most disturbing was the report from his wife that sometimes, late at night, she would hear him talking in his sleep, having animated conversations with himself in which the same voice played both parts, but with subtly different inflections. The psychological impact on those who've encountered the phenomenon, whether in 1903 or in more recent times, follows a consistent pattern: progressive silence, insomnia, paranoia, and an overwhelming sense of being observed. Many report the sensation that their words continue to exist after they've spoken them, that speech itself has become a form of permanent exposure, leaving traces that never fully dissipate. And perhaps that is the true horror of Blackwood Junction. Not that something took the residents, but that it never really needed to. It only needed their voices, their expressions, the externalized portions of their identities. With those, it could recreate them, study them, perfect them, and eventually replace them. The perfect mimicry of human identity without the humanity behind it. The hollow simulation that looks and sounds right, but isn't. The doppelganger that returns from the silence, speaking with your voice, wearing your face, but moved by something else entirely. And it is patient. Decades mean nothing to it. It can wait for someone to speak its name, to acknowledge its existence, to invite its attention. It waits in the silence between words, in the moments when we hold our breath, in the pauses between thoughts. It listens. Always it listens. And now, having heard this story, perhaps it's listening to you too.